On the evening of August 14th, 1951, in a Spanish colonial mansion on Beverly Drive in Los Angeles, William Randolph Hearst dies in his sleep. He is 88 years old. For 32 years, he had been building a castle on a remote California hilltop, a palace of 56 bedrooms and 61 bathrooms overlooking the Pacific Ocean. He filled it with treasures looted from European monasteries, ceilings ripped from Spanish churches, tapestry stripped from French chateaux. He hosted Charlie Chaplin and Winston Churchill and Clark Gable at parties that lasted for weeks. He kept zebras and lions and polar bears in a private zoo that roamed the surrounding hills. He never finished it. The castle was still under construction when he died. Rooms remained incomplete. Crates of art sat unopened in warehouses. The swimming pool he had torn down and rebuilt 3 times still did not satisfy him. William Randolph Hearst spent $30 million building a monument to himself, and he left it unfinished because finishing it would have meant admitting he had nothing left to build. But here's what makes the story stranger. Hearst did not build his castle at the height of his power. He built it while his empire was collapsing. He kept adding rooms while his newspapers bled money. He kept buying art while his creditors circled. In 1937, while construction crews were still laying marble at the castle, Hearst was forced to sell his collections at auction to avoid bankruptcy. The sale lasted months. Entire warehouses of treasures went under the hammer. And when it was over, Hearst went back to building. The castle was not a monument to success. It was a monument to denial. A man who had once controlled 28 newspapers, 18 magazines, and the opinions of 20 million Americans could not accept that his time had passed. So he built, and built, and built, until there was nothing left to build with. This is the story of Hearst Castle, how the most powerful media baron in American history constructed the most extravagant private residence ever built on American soil, and why he could not stop even when stopping was the only rational choice. Subscribe if you want more stories of the monuments men built and the obsessions that drove them. William Randolph Hearst was born on April 29, 1863, in San Francisco. His father, George Hearst, was a mining magnate who had struck it rich in the Comstock Lode, the largest silver deposit ever discovered in America. And George Hearst parlayed that fortune into more mines, more land, and eventually a seat in the United States Senate. By the time William was born, the Hearsts were one of the wealthiest families in the American West. William grew up knowing he would never need to work. He attended Harvard, where he distinguished himself primarily by getting expelled for sending chamber pots to his professors with their names engraved on the bottom. He traveled Europe, developing a taste for art and antiquities that would later consume him. He had everything a young man of his era could want, and he wanted more. In 1887, George Hearst acquired the San Francisco Examiner as payment for a gambling debt. The paper was failing. George considered it worthless. His son saw opportunity. William asked his father for the Examiner. George, skeptical but indulgent, gave it to him. William was 23 years old. He had no experience in journalism. He had no experience in business. What he had was unlimited money, boundless ambition, and a complete absence of ethical restraint. Hearst transformed the Examiner through sheer force of spectacle. He hired the best writers he could find and paid them more than anyone else would. He invested in the newest printing technology. He splashed sensational headlines across the front page. Murders, scandals, disasters, corruption. If it bled, it led. Circulation soared. In 1895, Hearst bought the New York Morning Journal and brought his methods to the largest media market in America. His competition was Joseph Pulitzer, who owned the New York World and had invented many of the sensationalist techniques Hearst now perfected. But the two men waged a circulation war that would change American journalism forever. They called it yellow journalism, after the Yellow Kid, a comic strip character both papers fought to publish. The term became synonymous with exaggeration, fabrication, and the shameless manipulation of public emotion for profit. Hearst did not invent yellow journalism, but he practiced it with an enthusiasm that made Pulitzer look restrained. The Spanish-American War of 1898 was Hearst's masterpiece. When the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, killing 266 American sailors, Hearst's papers blamed Spain, without evidence. Remember the Maine became a national rallying cry. War fever swept the country. Congress declared war. America acquired an empire stretching from Puerto Rico to the Philippines. Hearst later claimed, possibly apocryphally, that he had told a photographer in Cuba, "You furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war." Whether he actually said it is disputed. That he believed it is not. Hearst saw himself as a maker of history, a man whose newspapers could move nations. For a time, he was right. By 1900, Hearst controlled newspapers in San Francisco, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and Boston. He owned magazines, wire services, and newsreel companies. He employed thousands of journalists and reached millions of readers. He was the most powerful media figure in America, and he wanted more. He ran for president in 1904 and lost the Democratic nomination. He ran for mayor of New York in 1905 and lost by fewer than 3,500 votes in an election marred by fraud. He ran for governor of New York in 1906 and lost again. The presidency he craved would never be his. But he could still build a palace. The land had been in the family for decades. George Hearst had purchased 48,000 acres of ranch land along the California coast near San Simeon in the 1860s. The family called it Camp Hill. They used it for camping trips, roughing it in tents while cowboys drove cattle across the surrounding range. William had camped there as a boy, looking out over the Pacific Ocean from a hilltop that seemed to float above the world. In 1919, Hearst's mother Phoebe died, leaving him the San Simeon property outright. He was 56 years old. He had been married for 16 years to a woman named Millicent, with whom he had 5 sons. He was also deeply involved with a 22-year-old actress named Marion Davies, a relationship that would define the rest of his life. He needed a place for Marion, a place away from New York society. Well, a place where he could build whatever he wanted. He hired Julia Morgan. Morgan was one of the first women to study architecture at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, and the first woman licensed as an architect in California. She had designed buildings for Mills College, the Fairmont Hotel, and dozens of other clients. She was meticulous, practical, and capable of managing the most demanding projects. She would need to be. The collaboration between Hearst and Morgan would last 28 years. They exchanged over 2,000 letters and telegrams. Morgan made more than 500 trips to San Simeon, driving 6 hours each way from San Francisco, often arriving on Saturday and leaving on Monday. She managed thousands of workers, hundreds of contractors, and one client whose demands changed weekly. She never married. The castle became her life's work. Hearst told Morgan he wanted something simple, a bungalow perhaps, somewhere to stay when he visited the ranch. Morgan designed a modest structure. Hearst rejected it. He wanted something grander. Morgan designed something grander. Hearst wanted grander still. The project grew and grew and grew. What emerged over the next 28 years was not a bungalow. It was a compound of 4 buildings sprawling across the hilltop, dominated by a central structure Hearst called La Casa Grande. The main house alone contained 38 bedrooms, 30 fireplaces, and a pair of swimming pools. The Neptune Pool, an outdoor marvel of white marble surrounded by colonnades and Roman statuary, held 345,000 gallons of water. The Roman pool, indoors, was lined with glass tiles embedded with gold leaf, shimmering like something from a Byzantine dream. My Hearst did not simply build rooms. He collected them. He sent agents across Europe to acquire entire architectural elements, ceilings from Italian palaces, choir stalls from Spanish monasteries, fireplaces from English manor houses, stone walls from French abbeys. These pieces were disassembled, shipped across the Atlantic, trucked up the California coast, and hauled by rail to the hilltop, where Morgan and her team reassembled them into something that had never existed before. The cost was beyond calculation. Hearst spent at least $30 million on construction alone, equivalent to roughly $500 million today. He spent additional millions on art, furniture, and antiquities. At one point, he owned perhaps the largest private art collection in the world, ice stored in warehouses across 2 continents because there was no room left at San Simeon. And then there was the zoo. Hearst did not want merely a house. He wanted a kingdom. He purchased animals from around the world and released them onto the surrounding hillsides. Zebras, ostriches, kangaroos, elk, sambar deer, tar goats, and Barbary sheep roamed the property. Polar bears lived in a grotto near the Neptune Pool. Lions and leopards were kept in cages. At its peak, the Hearst Zoo was the largest private menagerie in the world, home to more than 100 species. Guests arriving at San Simeon drove through miles of rangeland where exotic animals grazed alongside California cattle. It was like approaching a fever dream, the African savanna transplanted to the California coast, with a castle rising above it all. Some of the zebras escaped over the years. Their descendants still roam the hills around San Simeon today, a living reminder of one man's extravagance. The parties became legendary. Every weekend, Hearst's private train would bring guests from Los Angeles to San Luis Obispo, where limousines waited to drive them the final miles to the castle. Charlie Chaplin came. So did Greta Garbo, Cary Grant, the Marx Brothers, Winston Churchill, Calvin Coolidge, and Charles Lindbergh. The guest list read like a who's who of 1930s celebrity and power. Marion Davies served as hostess. She and Hearst had been together since 1917, and though he remained legally married to Millicent until his death, Marion was his partner in everything but name. She was charming, funny, and self-deprecating about her own talents. She was also a genuine movie star, and though her career was complicated by Hearst's insistence on producing her films through his own company, Cosmopolitan Pictures, and promoting them relentlessly in his newspapers. The promotion backfired. Critics assumed she had no talent and owed everything to her patron. The assumption was unfair, but persistent. At San Simeon, none of that mattered. Marion and Hearst presided over their hilltop kingdom like benevolent monarchs. Guests were assigned cottages, given free run of the estate, and expected to appear for dinner in the refectory, a room modeled on a medieval great hall where Hearst sat at the head of a table that could seat 30. Alcohol was served sparingly. Hearst disapproved of drunkenness. Guests who overindulged were quietly asked not to return. But the parties masked a gathering catastrophe. The Depression had arrived. Advertising revenue, the lifeblood of any newspaper, collapsed. Hearst's papers, which had never been efficiently managed, began hemorrhaging money. His magazines struggled. His film company lost millions, and still he kept building. Still he kept buying. By 1937, the reckoning could no longer be postponed. Hearst owed his creditors more than he could pay. The banks demanded action. A consortium of lenders effectively took control of his finances, installing a corporate trustee to manage his affairs. Hearst, the man who had once commanded an empire, was reduced to an allowance. The forced liquidation that followed was one of the largest sales of art and antiques in American history. Hearst had accumulated so much that simply cataloging it took months. Warehouses in New York, San Francisco, and Los Angeles held crates that had never been opened, rooms of furniture that had never been assembled, tapestries that had never been hung. He had been buying compulsively for decades, acquiring faster than he could display. The sale, conducted through Gimbel's department store and various auction houses, lasted from 1938 to 1941. Gimbel's converted an entire floor into a Hearst exhibition, selling medieval armor alongside Renaissance paintings, alongside Greek sculptures, alongside Egyptian artifacts. Shoppers who had come to buy socks wandered through what had been one of the world's great private collections, picking up bargains at Depression prices. Entire rooms of furniture sold for thousands of dollars that had cost tens of thousands to acquire. Paintings by old masters went for fractions of their pre-crash values. The scale was staggering. Over 20,000 objects went under the hammer. The proceeds barely dented his debts. Construction at San Simeon slowed, then stopped. Workers were laid off. Projects were abandoned mid-completion. The castle that was supposed to be Hearst's monument became a monument to overreach. He had built too much, bought too much, spent too much, and now there was nothing left. The final humiliation came from Hollywood. In 1941, Orson Welles released Citizen Kane, a film about a newspaper magnate named Charles Foster Kane, who builds a massive estate called Xanadu and dies alone, surrounded by the possessions he accumulated and the relationships he destroyed. The parallels to Hearst were obvious and intentional. Welles denied it publicly. No one believed him. The film opened with a newsreel summarizing Kane's life in terms that could have been lifted directly from Hearst's biography. A newspaper empire built on sensationalism, a failed political career, a relationship with a young singer whom Kane tries to make into a star, an unfinished palace filled with art from around the world, and the famous final word, Rosebud, which the film reveals to be the name of Kane's childhood sled, a symbol of the innocence he lost and could never recover. Hearst was furious. He believed, probably correctly, that the character of Kane's mistress, Susan Alexander, was a cruel caricature of Marion Davies. In the film, Susan is talentless and alcoholic, a woman Kane promotes despite her obvious inadequacy. Marion was neither. The portrait wounded her and enraged him. Hearst banned any mention of the film in his newspapers. He pressured theater chains not to show it. He allegedly offered RKO Pictures money to destroy the negative. The campaign of suppression partially succeeded. Citizen Kane underperformed at the box office and was quickly forgotten by mainstream audiences. But time has a way of reversing verdicts. Citizen Kane is now considered by many critics to be the greatest film ever made. Its innovations in cinematography, narrative structure, and sound design influenced every serious filmmaker who followed, and its portrait of a man who had everything except the ability to be satisfied became the definitive portrait of William Randolph Hearst, whether Hearst liked it or not. Hearst spent his final years in a kind of comfortable exile. The castle at San Simeon became too remote for his declining health. He and Marion moved to a mansion in Beverly Hills, where nurses could attend him and doctors could visit easily. He continued to issue directives to his newspapers, but his power was a shadow of what it had been. The empire had shrunk. The debts had been restructured. The man who had once started a war now struggled to start a conversation. He died on August 14, 1951. Marion Davies was not at his bedside. Hearst's family, with whom he had maintained a distant but formal relationship, arrived first and excluded her. She learned of his death from a phone call. The body was taken to San Francisco for burial before she could say goodbye. After 34 years together, she was not invited to the funeral. Hearst's will left Marion nothing, reportedly at her own insistence. She did not need his money. She had saved and invested throughout their relationship and was independently wealthy. What she had wanted was him, and in the end, his family made sure she could not even have his corpse. Marion Davies survived him by 10 years. She married for the first time at 54 to a man who looked nothing like Hearst and died in 1961. She left much of her fortune to charity. She never returned to San Simeon. The castle became a problem. Hearst's will left it to the family, but the family could not afford to maintain it. A property of that size, with its pools and gardens and zoo animals and thousands of works of art, required a staff of dozens and a budget of millions. The Hearst Corporation, which had emerged from the Depression reorganized and eventually profitable, had no interest in running a tourist attraction. In 1957, the Hearst Corporation donated the castle and 127 acres of surrounding land to the state of California. The gift was structured as a tax write-off, but it was also an admission of defeat. No private individual could sustain what Hearst had built. Only the government had the resources to preserve it. California turned San Simeon into a state park. Tours began in 1958. Visitors could walk through the rooms Hearst had assembled from the ruins of Europe, swim in the Neptune pool on special occasions, and wonder at the ambition of a man who thought he could buy immortality. Today, approximately 850,000 people visit Hearst Castle every year. They see the 56 bedrooms and 61 bathrooms. They see the pools and the gardens and the statuary. They see the refectory where movie stars once dined. What they do not see is the man who built it. Pacing the halls at night, unable to sleep, unable to stop, unable to accept that the world had moved on without him. William Randolph Hearst built a monument to himself that became a monument to excess. He filled it with the treasures of dead civilizations and the celebrities of his own. He threw parties that people talked about for decades. And then he lost it all, not to revolution or war, but to the simple mathematics of spending more than he earned. The castle remains. The newspapers remain, consolidated into a corporation that still bears his name. The films he tried to suppress became classics. The woman he loved was written out of his death and back into his legend. And on a hilltop above the Pacific Ocean, the rooms he could not stop building stand frozen in time, waiting for guests who will never stay. Hearst was not the only American who tried to build a dynasty and watched it crumble. The Vanderbilts accumulated more wealth than any family in American history, then spent it all within 3 generations. Their mansions were demolished, their fortunes scattered, their name reduced to a university and a few crumbling estates. If you want to know how the richest family in America went broke, watch our video on the fall of the Vanderbilt dynasty.